So this morning we are on our third message in the series, as you've seen in the video just there. The series is entitled Life, Discipleship. Jesus' method is our model. And as I've told you from the beginning of this series, I'm a little bit on the simple side, so I need acrostics and things like that to help me remember stuff. And as we saw in the very first sermon, that there are four routines or four activities of discipleship that Jesus had with his small group. Now that small group are the 12 apostles. And he discipled them with these four activities constantly. What were those four activities? Number one, learning. The L in life reminds me, learning must be taking place for our disciples in our discipleship ministry. Number two, the I is for interceding, which means to give aid or to help. And we should help one another, especially as we learn those areas of need in our small groups, by one, praying for them, so we're giving them spiritual help. But number two, when we see there's physical needs that as a group we might be able to meet, then we help them in those physical areas as well. Today, number three is the F. It is for fellowshipping. And small group ministry needs to be fellowshipping because, it's really simple. As you fellowship, you get to know one another. As you get to know one another, you begin to love one another, like Jesus said. And as you love one another, then it's much easier to intercede for one another. You know what's going on in their life to pray for them. You know if there are physical needs that you can help meet those physical needs. And that often takes place in the fellowship context of a small group. But then next week, Lord willing, we'll look at the E. The E stands for engaging, where we want our small groups, like Jesus' first small group, to be going out constantly into the community and the world as a group, engaging the community around them. So that's what this series is all about. It's just seeing how Jesus discipled his 12 and learning from those activities how we ought to be very intentional in our small group ministry here at First Baptist. Now, that being said, every week we're looking at Acts chapter 2. We see in verses 42 through 47 how the church was actually practicing these four areas. Now, last Monday I told the pastors as we were meeting talking about this week's sermon, I was like, this week is the eating sermon. Because in fellowship with a small group, what are you supposed to do? Eat, exactly. And that's what we see in Acts chapter 2. Look in verse 42. It says, and they continued steadfastly, they were doing it all the time, in other words, in the apostles' doctrine, there's your learning, and fellowship in the breaking of bread. Now, what does that tell you right there? Eat. And if that didn't, connect with you, look down in verse 46. It says, so continuing daily. How often? Daily. With one accord in the temple and breaking of bread from house to house, they ate their food with gladness and simplicity of heart. Notice it's not just Sunday, it's not just in a learning environment in a classroom, but they were eating together constantly. I don't know which one came first, the chicken or the eggs. Which one came first? Baptist eating or, early church eating? I think we know the early church eating came first, and then we as Baptists, we just sort of adopted that. We like to eat, and the best place to eat is in fellowship. So now, here's the thing. You can be in a group and be totally alone. You know what I'm talking about? This is probably the most disconnected, connected people group in history. As Americans and as Westerners, we are connected all over the place, right? On my phone, Facebook, I'm off of it now, but when I was on it, I had well over 1,000 friends. Didn't know many of them, but I had plenty of them, right? And yet, people who have, 10,000 friends on social media find it difficult to find one person to share a meal with them. We are the most disconnected, connected people in human history. You can be in a group, a literal group, and not have any relationship whatsoever. And this isn't just a worldly thing. This can be a Christian thing. When I went to seminary, now what are we learning in seminary? We're learning all the Bible stuff and things. When I went to seminary, I was a commuter most of my time. What does that mean? I drove in, had my classes, and I drove back home. Now, I would go into a seminary class. There'd be 50 to 100 men in that classroom. We were waiting for the the professor to come in and lecture, and there would be a little huddle of guys over here in this corner. They're talking, they're laughing about everything they did, and another group over here. You could tell the commuters from the guys who lived on campus. Because the guys who lived on campus, they were hanging out, and this is just part of the campus educational life. But for we commuters, we came in, we didn't know anybody. Now, we learned, but we didn't relate. And that's the way it can even happen in a church. You can come into a large group meeting like this, and you can be here, and you can hear people singing, and you can hear me preaching and things like that. And you might learn, but you're really all alone here. You can even go into a small group on Sunday morning, just on small group, and you go into one of these classrooms, and you sit there, and you listen to the teacher teach, and you learn, but you're not connected with anybody else in that small group. That's not the way discipleship is supposed to function. Jesus set up discipleship so that you learn, and this is the way I describe it, you learn the parameters of relationships. The teachings of the Bible teach us how we are supposed to relate. First and foremost, we relate to God. It teaches us the parameters of that relationship. It starts only by faith in Jesus Christ, and then it teaches us how, once you put faith in Christ, how you live it out. We learn how to love one another based upon the teachings of Scripture. We learn about that kind of relationship, Christians loving Christians. We learn how to love our neighbors out in the community who may not be people of faith like we are, people who follow Christ. We learn from the Scripture how to relate to those people out there. Our learning in church is for the purpose of relating properly. But yet, if all you do is come on Sunday morning and you sit here and you learn, or you even go into a classroom and you learn, but you're not relating, then you're not fully developed as a disciple. Learning is only a part of discipleship, and that's what we see when it comes to Jesus' discipleship method. Now, today is the F, it is fellowshipping. Today is the fun part. Today is where we see how important fellowship was to Jesus and in what environments that Jesus had his disciples, his small group fellowshipping. And this is not a deep theological treatise kind of message that we're learning here today. If you came and you're like, I want to hear some doctrinal insights I never thought about, this is the wrong Sunday to be here. This is a Sunday we're just going to see very practically, here's how Jesus fellowshiped with his disciples. Here's 3 different areas where he fellowshiped with them, and these are 3 great areas for our small groups to fellowship as well. That's all we're looking at today. Very simple. Are you all okay with that? All right, let's look at these 3 areas of fellowship that ought to be happening in our small groups just like it happened in Jesus' first small group, okay? Number 1, Jesus fellowshipped in home gatherings. We're going to go to Matthew chapter 8. I want to read 2 verses, 14 and 15. Now, when Jesus had come into Peter's house, Jesus saw his wife's mother lying sick with a fever. So Jesus then touched her hand, and the fever left her. And she arose and served them. So I want you to notice Jesus is going with the 12, the disciples, and they're all going into Peter's house. Now, where had they been before this? You go earlier in the book of Matthew and you see that they had been doing ministry. In fact, Jesus' most famous sermon had happened just before they went to Peter's house. In Matthew chapters 5, 6, and 7, we see the Sermon on the Mount. And when Jesus was teaching, everybody was enthralled. They were astonished because he taught not like a professor lecturing a class. He taught in a very powerful way, in a very practical, relevant kind of way. And the people were just drawn to that. But these are people who were not yet putting their faith in Jesus. But Jesus' apostles and those others who followed with him also were learning as Jesus preached this sermon, right? So there was learning that was taking place there. But more than learning, there was ministry that wound up taking place because right after the Sermon on the Mount concluded, we see that Jesus performed a couple of miracles. And there's his disciples right there with him, ministering alongside of him. So there's this learning that's taking place. There's this engaging of the community through ministry, in this case, Jesus' miracles. So these ministry activities were taking place. But I want you to notice, after the preaching, after the miracles, then Jesus is saying, all right, fellas, we need to get alone for a while. And what do we see Peter doing? He volunteers his house. Jesus, y'all can come over. Everybody's welcome to come over to my house. And that's exactly what took place. Now, I want you to understand Two things, very simple things that we see from this text. Number one, I want you to note that small groups can meet in homes. Now that's astounding, isn't it? That just blows your mind kind of doctrine, right? But it's just simple, practical ministry. Meeting in homes. Look at verse 14 again. Now when Jesus had come into Peter's house. Now what's fascinating is that you understand that Peter invited Jesus and the boys over to his house without asking his wife. Right? Guys, we need to put our ears on right here. How do we know Peter invited everybody over without asking his wife? Because his wife's mom's over at their house. She's sick in bed. Ladies, if you've got a sick mother in bed at the house and your husband calls and says, hey, can me and the guys come on over? What's your response going to be? Not a good time, honey. So we know Peter didn't call before he invited Jesus and the boys over, right? That we might ought to learn from that one. Call first, okay? But what we see is that Jesus takes Peter up on this offer to come over to the house. Why? Because that's very important. Getting out of the ministry context and getting into a home environment is very important for discipleship to take place. Why? Because in the ministry environment, you're accomplishing certain tasks that environment is not conducive to the fellowship component. Now, how does that apply for us today in our church? If you go, a lot of y'all were in small groups, or you walk past small group rooms. I want you to know something. These small group rooms are not designed for fellowship, right? You go into it. Whoever decorated them was very institutionalized, right? It's institutional tan. And notice how they laid out the furniture. They have same kinds of seats as you're sitting in, and they're positioned the same way you're positioned right now, where all the attention is focused forward. So you would have a teacher at the front, and then you would have all these rows looking at the teacher. I'm not sure that's not conducive to relationship, is it? There's, the wall hanging there is not a pretty picture of a family. What is it? It's a marker board. And maybe you're in the more older fashioned groups, and you even have the old maps that fold up and go over. Everything about the rooms in this building surrounding the sanctuary here is designed for one activity of discipleship. What is that activity? Learning. But it is not conducive to fellowship. What is a very conducive environment for fellowship? Folks, it's where the couch is, and the recliner, and the end tables and the coffee table. And you can take, even the dining room table, if it's an open floor concept house, you got all this open room, and the small group can get together and they can set their drinks on the table and their little plate of finger foods and snacky snacks and all that kind of stuff. And man, that's conducive for a relationship. And that's what Jesus wanted. He didn't want them just to do ministry. He wanted them to be able to hang out together and to get to know each other beyond just the learning event. So small groups can meet in homes. That's a really good place for relationships. Secondly, I want you to notice small groups can minister in homes. It's not that there can be no ministry. Look at the second part of verse 14. So Jesus saw Peter's wife's mother lying sick with a fever. So what did Jesus do? So he touched her hand, and the fever left her. Let me ask you this very simple probing question. If Jesus had taken the disciples to the local synagogue for this period of rest, sort of like we come to the local church facility, would he have ever had the chance to minister to Peter's mother-in-law? No, because you know as well as I do, someone with a fever, we even tell them sometimes, stay home. Right? He would have never had the opportunity to minister to Peter's mother-in-law had they not gone to Peter's house. Because it's in the home where real life happens. It's in the home where you see how people live. You sometimes even see needs that they didn't necessarily intend on you to see. I remember at times being in a small group and we go to somebody's home and you can see a light bulb click in the guy's head. He's like, oh, fellas, while I got you here, there's a piece of furniture that my wife wanted me to move, and I can't move it by myself. Could you all help me with that? And to the guys in the small group, that's just nothing. Sure, no problem at all. But to that family, that's a lot. And that wouldn't happen in a sterile classroom. That happens in the home. And that's what we understand, that when we go into the homes, we see people in their real context, and we see sometimes real needs that otherwise they probably would never mention. And that's good. That's where we get to know each other. But now, if there aren't any real life needs that you see when you go to somebody's home, we still get to do our favorite thing, right? The third thing we see here is that small groups can eat meals in homes. We get to eat. And that's exactly what I think happened. In verse 15, second part, after Jesus touched Peter's mother-in-law, she arose and served them. And what do you think it means that she served them? Oh, you know what it means. Any elderly woman worth her weight in salt, right? If she feels good and there's company that comes in, she's heading for the fridge. She's opening up the fridge. She's pulling out the leftovers. She's going to the microwave, heating them up. She's over here throwing in a cake mix with some peaches in there, making a peach cobbler, and sending the kids to the local Dollar General to get some vanilla bean ice cream. Because any woman like the mother-in-law here, when there's a bunch of young men in the house, you got to feed them, right? Small groups need food. Even Jesus, a small group, needs food. Can you imagine Peter's mother-in-law coming up to Jesus with his plate? I can just see her saying, Jesus, you're getting too skinny. You ain't been eating enough. I put Peter's portion of the food on your plate, because that's just Peter. He doesn't eat it anyway. And she probably gave him a double portion. Why? Because that's serving. And that kind of serving, sharing a meal together, takes place in a home better than anywhere else. And Jesus wanted his disciples in that kind of relational environment. So we understand that, one, small groups can meet in homes. If it was good enough for Jesus, it should be good enough for us. But the homes aren't the only place. The second thing is that Jesus fellowshiped in social gatherings. Now I want us to go to John chapter 2. Verses 1 through 4, it says, on the third day there was a wedding in Cana of Galilee, and the mother of Jesus was there. Now both Jesus and his disciples were invited to the wedding. And when they ran out of wine, the mother of Jesus said to him, they have no wine. And Jesus said to Mary, his mom, said, woman, that doesn't sound disrespectful in Greek, okay? That's not disrespectful. But he said to his mom, said, woman, what does your concern have to do with me? My hour has not yet come. Now, what's the social gathering where Jesus and his disciples are located now? It's a wedding. And folks, throughout human history, every civilization has particular social gatherings out in sort of a public venue for people to gather. Friends, family, they come together for these social gatherings, and it's a good thing. Human beings work well when they socialize with one another. But I want you to notice, it isn't necessarily in a private home for a very small group. This is much more of a public kind of environment, a wedding in the village of Cana. Now, that being said, there's two things I want us to notice about this social gathering. Because Jesus had his apostles not in the private home of Peter, but now in a social environment of a wedding. Two things I want us to notice. Number one, small groups can attend social gatherings together. Really? That's all you're going to say, Marty? Yes, it's very simple. Our small groups can go out into the public to these social gatherings, just like Jesus. Verse 1, on the third day there was a wedding in Cana of Galilee, and the mother of Jesus was there. Verse 2, now both Jesus and his disciples were invited to the wedding. They were invited to this social gathering. And what did Jesus do? He said, let's go, fellas. And they loaded up and they went to the wedding. And that's just a social place. Jesus wasn't necessarily there for ministry. He was there to interact socially with people and his disciples. Now, every culture throughout history has social gatherings. When we take mission teams down to Belize, one thing that we sometimes do with our teams on our day off, we'll take them to the Mayan ruins, right, Blaine? Yeah. There's 2 or 3 major Mayan ruins in the area where we do our ministry and things. So one thing I was fascinated by the first time I went to them, and it's at all of the ruins, is that they have ball courts. One in particular, a little bigger, has, I think, 3 ball courts, isn't it? Yeah. So they have these ball courts where the ancient Mayans would play a particular sport. And People would come and they would gather. And what I learned from that is every culture, no matter how primitive they are, they have these social gatherings. Now, we in America, we have a lot of social public gatherings. And a lot of these, I think, would be very conducive for your small groups to go together to them. For instance, you have social gatherings. It may be sports. You may want to go up and watch the Predators up in Nashville. You may want to go to a college game, one of the local colleges. You may want to just go to a high school game and watch some things together as a group, and you just have a good time watching the games. You know, there are other events that take place. You got to be careful with these, okay? Let me tell you right now, because there's a lot of events out there that's being put on that is just not any good. But, you know, like comedy. There's Christian comedy events that take place. There's Christian concerts that take place. There's a lot of events, social events like that. Or it may be that as a group, you're going to go to the wedding of somebody's kids in your class, in your small group. Or maybe it's a graduation. Or maybe it's an anniversary. Somebody's throwing an anniversary party or a birthday party. These are public social gatherings where your group can go together. There's movies. There's a few that you could go. Most of them you can't even go to. There's maybe go for a bike ride, a hike, a picnic. You know, all these different public events, or you may create your own public event. You can go do those. Jesus did. They went to a wedding. We can go to these different events. Well, what's the purpose if we go to these public social events? The purpose is simply to enjoy ourselves with one another. That's the second thing. Small groups can enjoy social gatherings together. Notice again in verse 3, it says, "And when they ran out of wine, the mother of Jesus said to Jesus, they have no wine." Now, why did Mary come to Jesus and say that? What did Mary want? Mary wanted Jesus to go to work, right? Mary knew somehow that Jesus could take care of this problem. So she wanted to go put Jesus in a situation where he would go to work. But notice in verse 4 what Jesus said. Jesus said to Mary, his mother, said, "Woman, what does your concern have to do with me? My hour has not yet come." Now, we understand doctrinally that Jesus is about to perform the first miracle of his public ministry that is recorded. We know that. He's going to turn water into wine. We understand that theologically, the turning of the water into wine is what the Messiah would do, as it was prophesied in the Old Testament, that the wine would flow from the mountains and all this. We understand all that. That's not what I'm talking about. What I want you to notice in there, did Jesus come to the wedding expecting to go to work? He didn't come to the wedding. He said, "What's this got to do with me?" In other words, why would he be at the wedding if he didn't come to the wedding and expect to work? Why would he be at the wedding with his disciples? To enjoy the wedding, to celebrate the marriage. He and his disciples went with the intent of just having a good time at the wedding. Now, he honored his mother, and he did go to work, and he turned the water into wine and that kind of stuff, but he ultimately was just expecting to enjoy himself at the wedding. There are times that in our small groups, in our church, we just need to have fun together. I had a man who, very influential in my Christian life, when I was young, in my teens, he made the comment. He said, "Church is no place for softball." That bothered me. You know why it bothered me? Because I like softball. And I thought, okay, I get it. Softball is not a spiritual thing. Church is for spiritual matters. But my heart just couldn't connect to what this man that I highly respect to this day said. And I think my heart was troubled by that because that man was wrong. There are times that as Christians, we are supposed to just have fun together. Even if it's just going out to the social event of a softball game and playing softball. Or nowadays, it's not softball. What is it nowadays? Pickleball. Exactly. It doesn't look like a pickle at all if you haven't played it. But still, sometimes we just are supposed to come together and enjoy being together, doing something out in public. This is what brings small group members together to the point where you like hanging out with each other, that leads to love. You remember what Jesus said in John 13? He said, "A new commandment I give to you, that you have more education, learning. No, that you have love one for another." Love is a relational, not an educational activity. You can learn and learn and learn and learn, but if you don't love, your learning has failed. And our small group discipleship, just like Jesus's, ought to create environments where our people can love one another, just like Jesus taught us. Jesus said, "By this they will know that you are mine if you learn more information." No. He said, by this, by loving one another, they will know that you are mine. If you look around the room right now, do you see people that you truly love? Or is your church life so sterile that all you do is come into a sanctuary, you learn information from the preaching, you may even feel good from the singing, but there's no loving because you quickly exit and you have no time for the people sitting in the sanctuary during the week. Jesus' discipleship process was more than learning. It was loving by living life during the week. That fellowship is very important. So we fellowship in the privacy of one another's homes. We fellowship out in the community at these different social events. And one of the greatest places where we can fellowship, like Jesus did, is during the holidays. The third thing is Jesus fellowshipped in holiday gatherings. We're going to jump to Luke chapter 22, verses 7 through 15. "So then came the day of unleavened bread, when the Passover must be killed. And Jesus sent Peter and John, saying, 'Go and prepare the Passover for us, that we may eat.' So you had Peter and John. They said to Jesus, 'Where do you want us to prepare it?' And Jesus said to Peter and John, said, 'Behold, when you have entered the city, a man will meet you carrying a pitcher of water. Follow that man into the house which he enters. Then you shall say to the master of the house, the teacher says to you, where is the guest room where I may eat the Passover with my disciples? Then the master of the house will show you a large furnished upper room. There, make ready.' So Peter and John went, and they found it just as Jesus had said to them, and they prepared the Passover. Now when the hour had come, Jesus sat down, and the 12 apostles with him. And then Jesus said to the apostles, 'With fervent desire I have desired to eat this Passover with you before I suffer.'" What we have here is a depiction or a description of the last holiday that Jesus shared with his disciples before his crucifixion. Now, this isn't the only holiday. This is the last holiday. We read in the Gospels that Jesus and his disciples were pretty much together for all of the holidays of ancient Israel. Why? Because Jesus loved being with his apostles, and his apostles loved being with Jesus and the other apostles. And the holidays was a great day for them to get together. Now, two last things I want us to think about. Number one, small groups can prepare for holidays together. Look again in verse 8. It says, "And Jesus sent Peter and John, saying, 'Go and prepare the Passover for us, that we may eat.' So Peter and John then said to Jesus, 'Where do you want us to prepare?'" Now, I have always heard in leadership that when it is a very important thing that must get done, do you send your most notable or your least notable people that you oversee? The most responsible, the most important, if it is a very important thing for you, or do you send the ones that are the least? If you had to name the least of the apostles, which one would they be? The least. Judas, somebody says. Yep, I think that's a pretty good answer right there. And the others, you're like, oh, what is his name? Maybe Bartholomew? Any of y'all think about Bartholomew all the time when you think about the apostles? How about Simon the Zealot? Not Simon Peter, but Simon the Zealot. There was a second Simon there. You all think about him a whole lot? You know, if I was in Jesus' shoes and there was something that wasn't really all that important to me, I'd say, hey, Bartholomew, Bart, will you and Mr. Z right here, can you all go take care of this not so important thing? Now, if it's something very important for me, then I'm going to pick the ones that I have put the most time in, I trust the most. Who did Jesus pick to prepare for the holiday? Peter and John. I don't know about you all, but to me, those are probably the two most notable of all the apostles. And to prepare for a small group holiday gathering, Jesus picked the two most notable of all of the disciples to prepare for that. What that tells me is that this holiday gathering was extremely important to Jesus. Now, what we are doing with our small groups is we're not trying to just start a whole new small group ministry. Our small groups have been doing great way before I ever got here. Well, all we're trying to do is with intentionality help the teachers by getting 3 more designated leaders in these 3 relational designated ministries. One is interceding, one leader for the intercession, spiritual prayer, and also physical helps. Another one is engaging, so that we're well equipped on the inside of the church to go outside and engage the lost community around us. But we have a designated leader, that's our goal, in each of our adult small groups that is over fellowshipping. Let me tell you, if you are that designated leader, you have volunteered to do that, I want you to understand your role is critical to the discipleship in that ministry. Growing up, the way I was taught to view small groups, Sunday school, we didn't call them small groups, we call them Sunday school. The way I was raised is that the teacher is up here, level A. And anybody who was working on the fellowship or cards or anything down here, level B, leadership. Let me tell you, that's wrong. What we see in Jesus' method is that the teacher, level A, and what we're trying to focus on, the intercessory leader, the fellowship leader, the engagement leader, they're all level A leaders. Because the teacher can teach the concepts, but it's these other 3 leaders in our small groups that's creating the environment to live out the concepts. And if all we do is learn, Jesus even told the Pharisees, said, you think your salvation is found in the Scriptures. In other words, they're always learning. And the problem is what they learned did not equate into right relationship, because what Jesus was saying is salvation is standing right here in front of you, and you're missing me. Now, you think you're saved because you learned so much of the Bible, but it's the relationship that the Bible is pointing you toward. And Jesus was saying, I am the one who will be your salvation. You see, learning is to move us to relationship. Learning is not the end of the game. And that's why even fellowship leaders, level A, creating the environment where we learn to love one another. We experience the love. And if all you do is come on Sunday morning and you don't do anything else with God's people, you're just barely putting your foot in the discipleship waters. You got to jump both feet. Learn it and live it in community of your small group. That's discipleship. And that's what we see here. Jesus was picking the 2, what we would say the most important. He invested more time in these 2 disciples. He picked them to prepare the place for the holiday fellowship because it was that important to him. And it wasn't that he just picked and prepared it. He wanted all of them participating. That's the last thing this morning. Small groups can participate in holiday together. Notice, verse 14, when the hour had come, that's the hour of the celebration, Jesus sat down and the 12 apostles sat down with him. Notice what Jesus said in verse 15. Then Jesus said to them, with fervent desire, I have desired to eat this Passover with you. Fervent, not just desire, fervent desire. Notice what he didn't say. With fervent desire, I have desired to lecture you, to teach you, to educate you. No. He said, with fervent desire, I have desired to eat this holiday meal with you. Because Jesus understood, I didn't come just to educate you. I came to save you so that you can be right with the Father, with one another, and even right with those outside. We learn to live as disciples, and we live in that one another environment. We live in small groups. That's where we need to be. It's very interesting, though, when churches focus on small groups, all the right stuff starts happening. Research has shown that 90% of churches who focus on small groups are growing. Now, what is the antithesis of that? If a church doesn't focus on small group, guess what happens? They decline. 77% of people who have been surveyed in small groups say that their discipleship growth is heavily impacted by their discipleship small group. It's not just coming to worship and hearing the preacher preach. It's in the small group where they are growing. And when it comes to guests, churches that push guests and encourage them to get into small groups, if they can get their guests into a small group, they have 80% retention rates. And if guests do not ever get into a small group, that plummets down to almost nothing. They will eventually leave the worship environment. Why? Because they have no relationships. Do you see how important small groups are? So important that Jesus' primary discipleship was in a small group environment with the 12. So important that he taught them and he took them, but he also fellowshiped with them and loved them. That's discipleship.